Are you ready to see one of the craziest swords you'll ever see? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria, and it's not this sword, okay? So I'm going to show you one of the craziest swords you're ever going to see from anywhere in the world. And if you're a follower of our Facebook page, link below, then you will have already seen this, but now you're going to see it in action in my hand, so to speak. If you don't follow that page, you won't have seen it yet. And the sword I'm holding at the moment is a clue in that, yes, indeed, this is an Indian sword. Now, the fact is that India, large continent, large population, hundreds and hundreds of years of history of swords and swordsmanship. So if you want to look at some of the most diverse designs, innovative designs, crazy designs, and sometimes really amazingly technologically great designs and manufacture of swords in the world throughout human history, look at India. Regular viewers of this channel will know that I am a massive fan of Indian and Indo-Persian weapons. And I really can't state highly enough how, if you're interested in swords, you probably need to learn more about Indian weapons, because it's an incredibly diverse field with an incredibly rich culture and history to it. Now, if you know anything at all about Indian swords, you will know that pretty much the most common type of Indian sword to encounter is the tulwar. I made a video recently, I think about a week ago, talking about why tulwars were so feared by Europeans and emulated and used by Europeans as well. And for many reasons, Indian swordsmanship, also quality of manufacture of the blades, the sharpness of the blades, and the design themselves, very innovative, usually curved blades, not always, I'll come back to that in a second, usually curved blades, but also very distinctive hilt style that enforces, or rather encourages, a certain cutting style using the whole body's movement and passing footwork, which leads to very, very powerful and fearsome cuts. I'm not going to say it's necessarily the most effective sword or the most effective swordsmanship style against everything else, because it's a bit like rock, paper, scissors. Different things have different advantages against other things. And it was noted by Europeans that in India, campaigning in India, that particularly the thrust was sometimes from a sword, the thrust was sometimes not so practiced at dealing with in India. And so for that reason, a lot of, for example, British officers and others out in India advised to rely more on the point, because the point was found to be particularly effective in Indian warfare. That being said, tulwars more than held their own, and there were a series of wars across really several centuries, but in the colonial period, particularly the 18th and 19th century, and then if we go back earlier into the 17th and 16th centuries, were actually where the basis of sort of European interactions in India started. But also, of course, there were a huge number of wars in India between different states. So what people often forget, I think, in the modern world is that India wasn't one unified country until the sort of later period. If we go back into the 16th and 17th centuries, much like lots of other places in the world, there was a warring period between different big states under different rulers: the Mughals, the Marathas, the Rajputs, the Sikhs, various others, okay, and they were often allied with each other or at war with each other. And so you also find different types of swords in different regions. So whether it's the Dandpata, or whether it's the Katar, or whether it's the Talwar, or what forms of Shamshir, whatever, you find are more popular in different regions, sometimes with different religious proportions and cultural influences, sometimes influence from Persia or Afghanistan. Sometimes, in fact, cultural influence down in the south from Spain and Portugal, for example, because of the trade that was happening down there as well. So much so that, this is where we come back to the other sword I was holding at the beginning here. As I've mentioned in many of my videos, in the 17th and 18th centuries, it was incredibly common to find European blades on Indian swords. Now, I'm not going to belabor this point because I've covered it in previous videos, but the fact is this is a European blade. This is a probably 17th, maybe early 18th century European saber blade mounted on a type of basket hilt. And that's the other thing to bear in mind, is that while the tulwar is the most famous Indian sword hilt probably in the modern world, these basket hilts were actually very, very popular, particularly with the Marathas, but with various other people as well, Sikhs included, in the the 18th century and earlier than that. They go all the way back. In fact, they go way back in time. And actually, without this front knuckle bow, this top element here with a sort of cross guard with a disc, and then this kind of hemispherical pommel with an extension stalk at the bottom, or sometimes without it. This goes all the way back into what we would call the medieval period, so it goes all the way back into the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries. By the 16th century, very often starting to get an enclosed basket hilt, and as I say, very often with European blades. And in fact, there are also, down in the south, we do often find even European rapier blades, so long, thin, thrusting swords. That's right, in India, it wasn't all curved swords, it wasn't all sabres, it wasn't all big, broad blades used in India. So sometimes you find thrusting, straight, narrow blades mounted on Indian hilts. But today we're not going to be looking specifically at those. This is a type of sword. This is one of the craziest swords, I think one of the craziest swords that you can find. So familiarise yourself with the proportions relative to me of a standard tulwar here. Essentially a sabre blade that's about the same as same kind of proportions as most European sabres, or a Chinese dao, certainly of this period anyway, or something like even a katana or tachi blade. These sorts of proportions, this sort of size, is a fairly typical tulwar. And I should also mention tulwar is a non-specific word, it just means sword, but in the modern world, modern collecting world, we call this a tulwar. What this is a tulwar on steroids. Not just a few steroids, this is a tulwar on a lot of steroids, and I picked this up literally last week, comes straight out of someone's collection, been there for a long time, been somewhat neglected, is a little bit rusty and needs cleaning up, but here it is. This is like the mother of all tulwar. Now, a lot of people who know about these things will be shouting at the screen at this point and going, that's not a tulwar, it's a Tegha. Well, I've looked into the linguistics of this. Now, in the modern collecting world, it is a convention to call a standard size curved sword like this, an Indian sword, a tulwar, and to call a really broad one a Tegha. However, looking at the linguistic sources from the 19th century, it does seem a little bit more complicated than that. So it does seem that in some sources in the 19th century, the word Tegha actually could mean this. So sometimes Tegha is used to mean what we would now call a tulwar, and equally a tulwar, the word tulwar, can mean any sword. So this is a very common factor. This isn't specific to Indian swords. If we look at Japan, for example, then katana comes from uchigadana and can just mean any sword. And in fact, you can refer to big swords or short swords, and wakizashi is not always called a wakizashi. If we come to Europe, then of course we often in the modern world refer to a messer. Messer just means knife. We could refer to a langmesser, grossmesser, kriegmesser, all of these kinds of things. And we kind of think that it means a specific type of sword, but it doesn't linguistically. Another common example I mention is Joseph Swetnam's use of the word longsword, which for him didn't mean what we mean when we say longsword. For him it just meant a long one-handed sword that wasn't a rapier. So kind of just a sword with a swept hilt or a basket hilt with a fairly long blade. So coming back to this in the modern collecting world would be called a Tegha, but it might not always in period be called a Tegha. Other people would refer to this as an Indian executioner's sword. And do you know what? It's not. I don't think it is. The research that I've done so far suggests absolutely that these Tegha, if we use that word, these Tegha actually were used in warfare sometimes, and they weren't specific to executioners. In fact, it seems that executioners, which were a thing in India, various different princely states and kingdoms in India did have forms of execution which were done in various different ways, and they did sometimes use swords, but it seems like they didn't necessarily have a specific sword, although they did sometimes use this sword. But just because they sometimes used this sword, but they also sometimes used a sword like this, didn't mean that either of those swords were specifically executioner's swords. They just were a sword. So yes, indeed, while someone might sometimes use an axe for execution, it doesn't necessarily mean that that axe is an executioner's axe. It means it's an axe that's used for an execution, but that axe might also be a fighting axe or whatever. So these Teghas are usually referred to as a Tegha, and they're very often referred to as executioner's swords. However, they are not necessarily factually in period either of those things. This might be referred to as a tulwar or various other words used in Hindi and other languages in India. And indeed, while they were used by executioners, it seems like they were also used by other people as well. And I do know that there are people, for example, in the Shasta video communities, who do demonstrate ways of using these in combat, which I'll talk about in a second, actually. Another reason that I don't think this is specifically an executioner's weapon is that, okay? I don't think that you need to fit a knuckle bow on a weapon, on an object that is not being used for fighting. You will notice that lots of Indian swords do not have knuckle bows on them. They just have a simple crossguard, okay? However, some Indian swords, other Indian swords, do have a full basket hilt. So in India, we can find types of sword which have sometimes no handguard, or just a simple little crossguard, or sometimes have a knuckle bow, or sometimes a full basket hilt. So my argument would be that this sword, which has a massive blade on it, doesn't necessarily, I don't think it's necessarily an executioner's sword when it's got something as explicit as a knuckle bow added on it, because why would you have that if it's just for lopping people's heads off? So, this massive thing, it is pretty massive. In terms of length, it's actually not particularly big at all. It's actually this is a fairly long tulwar, I have to say, but it's about the same length as a typical tulwar, but clearly the width is excessive to say the least. It is sharp, it has a forged edge, it is relatively nicely produced. It's not the best quality craftsmanship in the world, but it's pretty damn good. You'll also notice it's got some writing on it, which at some point I'll get translated. The hilt has, it seems, been plated or gilded or something, but I need to clean it up more, and I need to clean some of the rust off carefully. Obviously this is going to undergo a gentle restoration process here in my workshop, but this is an absolutely ludicrous weapon, and to move around it's actually not that bad if you move it in the correct way. So don't think about throwing the thing out here like you might hit with a mace. Instead, think about sweeping it across the target, and if you do that, you can actually move the thing around you relatively easy. Yes, it is far more difficult to move than a typical tulwar and slower, but if you think about delivering this with push cuts and draw cuts like this that move around and forwards and backwards, it's actually not too bad. Also, in terms of the hilt, notice that my hand does just about squeeze into that hilt. Obviously Indian hilts are often quite tight fit, but my hand does fit into there. Moreover, you'll notice that the disc pommel is slightly angled that way, which adds to the comfort of holding it. And as I say, it has a knuckle bow on there. So, for those of you who didn't know, and that's why I'm putting this in my obscure weapons playlist, and if you haven't watched the other episodes in this playlist, please do. This is one of the most ludicrous swords, and I love it for that, incidentally. That's not a criticism, that's a good thing. One of the most ludicrous swords from history, the Indian Tegha, as it's commonly known, which is essentially a beefed up, hugely broad, and usually pretty damn curved tulwar on steroids. And I absolutely love it. And I've wanted one of these for years, and I'm very, very happy to now have one of these in my collection. Thanks a lot for watching, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel soon. Cheers, folks.